The air inside the old truck smelled of stale coffee and maps that had been folded and refolded too many times. While Clara stared out the window at the passing blur of gray sycamore trees, they weren't talking. Not because they were angry, but because the weight of what they were doing was too heavy for small talk. They had sold their small suburban home, packed their lives into a series of cardboard boxes, and were driving toward a town that didn't even have a functioning stoplight. "Are you sure the GPS is right?" Clara finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders. David glanced at the screen. "It says 2 miles. Just past the old grain mill." They were looking for the St. Jude's property, though property was a generous word for what the listing had shown. In the photos, the building looked like a ghosta, skeletal remains of a church built in the late 1800s, smothered in ivy and forgotten by time. Most people saw a liability. David and Clara, for reasons they still couldn't quite explain to their worried parents, saw a lifeboat. As they rounded the final bend, the trees thinned out, and there it was. The building sat on a slight rise, surrounded by tall, yellowing grass that swayed like a sea in the wind. The stone walls were darkened by decades of rain and soot, and the great wooden doors were arched, looking like a pair of folded hands. But the most striking thing was the silence. There were no birds singing here, no sound of traffic, just the wind whistling through the cracks in the masonry. David pulled the truck to a stop, the tires crunching on the gravel path that had long since been reclaimed by weeds. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there, looking at the bell tower. The copper top had turned a vivid, ghostly green. "It looks like it's waiting for something," Clara said, her hand reaching for the door handle. They stepped out into the biting afternoon air. The ground was soft and muddy under their boots. As they approached the main entrance, the sheer scale of the task ahead hit them. This wasn't just a fixer-upper. This was a monumental ruin. A window on the side had been smashed, and a thick vine of ivy had snaked its way through the broken glass. Disappearing into the darkness of the interior, David pulled a heavy iron key from his, cocked a key that felt like it weighed 5 pounds. He stepped up to the doors. His heart was hammering against his ribs. This was the leap. Every cent they owned, every dream they had nurtured during their lean years, was tied to this key. He slid it into the lock. He had to lean his shoulder into the wood, feeling the grain of the ancient oak against his skin. With a loud, metallic clunk that echoed across the empty field, the bolt slid back. He pushed. The doors groaned, a long, low sound that felt like the building was waking up from a century-long nap. As the doors swung open, a cloud of dust danced in the shafts of light that broke through the gloom. The smell hit them instantly. It wasn't just rot. It was the smell of old paper, cold stone, incense from 100 years ago, and something else, ... Something like honey. They stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under their weight, the sound echoing up into the vaulted ceiling. It was beautiful. Even with the bird droppings, the piles of fallen plaster, and the rusted light fixtures hanging by wires, the architecture was breathtaking. The arches soared upward, disappearing into shadows where the rafters held the weight of the roof. Clara walked toward the center of the room, her footsteps light. She looked up at the main window behind where the altar once stood. It was boarded up with plywood, but thin rays of light bled through the cracks, illuminating the dust motes like tiny stars. "We're crazy, aren't we?" she asked, turning to look at David. David walked over to her and took her hand. His palms were sweaty, probably. "But look at this place, Clara. They don't build things with this much soul anymore. If we don't save it, it'll be a parking lot in 6 months." They spent the next 3 hours exploring. They found a small spiral staircase that led to the choir loft, where the wood was so soft they were afraid to step on it. They found the basement, which was bone-chillingly cold and filled with old hymnals that had turned into a single. On a small wooden table sat a glass jar. Inside the jar was a withered rose, completely dried and brown, and a small note written in elegant fading cursive, for those who come after. Do not let the light go out. Clara touched the glass of the jar. David, come look at this. As they read the note together, a sudden heavy thud sounded from the back of the church. They both froze. It sounded like a footstep, or a heavy door closing. Hello? David called out. His voice bounced off the stone walls, hollow and thin. There was no answer. Only the sound of the wind picking up outside, rattling the plywood over the windows. They walked back toward the main hall. As they passed the entrance to the cellar, David noticed something he hadn't seen before. The floor in the corner wasn't made of wood. It was a heavy stone slab with a rusted iron ring set into it. It was covered in a thick layer of grime, but as David kicked away some of the debris, he saw carvings around the edge of the stone. Symbols. Not religious ones, but older, stranger marks. This wasn't in the blueprints, David muttered. He reached down and gripped the iron ring. He pulled, but the stone didn't budge. It felt like it was part of the very foundation of the earth. Just as he was about to try again, a shadow moved across the plywood window. A man was standing outside, watching them through a gap in the boards. David jumped back, his heart racing. Hey, who's there? The shadow vanished. They ran to the front doors and stepped out onto the porch. But the field was empty. The tall grass was waving in the wind, and the road was silent. The only thing they saw was a set of fresh footprints in the mud, leading away from the church and toward the thick woods at the edge of the property. The footprints were deeply pressed, as if whoever had been standing there was carrying something incredibly heavy. Clara leaned against the doorframe, her breath coming in short gasps. Maybe the townspeople aren't as happy about us being here as we thought. We're not leaving, David said, though his voice lacked conviction. He looked back into the dark maw of the church. They spent their first night in the church, sleeping on an inflatable mattress in the middle of the great hall. The building groaned and popped as the temperature dropped. Every sound felt like a warning. David lay awake for hours, staring up at the dark rafters. He thought about the note in the jar. Do not let the light go out. Around 3 a.m., David was jolted awake. It wasn't a sound that woke him, but a sensation. The floor was vibrating. A low, rhythmic hum was pulsing through the wood, so faint he could feel it in his teeth more than he could hear it with his ears. He sat up. Looking at Clara, she was still fast asleep, her face pale in the moonlight. The humming seemed to be coming from the corner with the stone slab. He got up quietly, grabbing his flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, hitting the stone floor. As he approached the corner, the vibration grew stronger. He knelt down and placed his hand on the cold stone. It was warm. Not just room temperature, but warm, as if there was a furnace burning deep beneath the soil. And then, he heard it from beneath the stone. A sound like rushing water or hundreds of voices whispering in unison. He scrambled back, his breath hitching in his throat. He looked at the heavy oak doors he had locked and bolted earlier that evening. They were standing wide open. The cool night air drifted in, smelling of pine and damp earth. David stood there, paralyzed. He knew he had locked those doors. He had checked the bolt 3 times. He walked slowly toward the entrance, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He peered out into the darkness. There, standing at the edge of the gravel path, was an old man. He wore a heavy wool coat and held a lantern that wasn't lit. He wasn't moving. He was just staring at the church with an expression of profound sadness. "Can I help you?" David called out, his voice cracking. The man didn't move for a long time. Then he raised a hand and pointed toward the bell tower. His voice was raspy, like sandpaper on wood. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Before David could respond, the man turned and walked into the darkness. David ran to the edge of the porch, shining his light, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no footsteps in the mud this time, no rustle of grass. David went back inside and slammed the doors, locking them with trembling hands. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat by the mattress, watching the stone slab in the corner, waiting for the humming to start again. When the sun finally rose, Casting a pale orange light through the cracks in the walls, the church looked different. It didn't look like a project anymore. It looked like a challenge. Clara woke up and saw David sitting there, his eyes bloodshot. "You okay?" she asked, reaching out to touch his arm. David looked at her, then at the stone slab, which was now cold and silent. He thought about the man and the humming and the open doors. He looked at his wife, at the hope in her eyes, and the way she was already planning where the kitchen would go. "I'm fine," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about where to start. We have a lot of work to do." He didn't tell her about the man or the warmth in the stone. He didn't want to break the spell. But as he stood up, he felt a strange weight in his pocket. He reached in and pulled out a small, smooth stone he didn't remember picking up. Carved into the surface was a single word. Redeemed. The second week in the church felt like a war. Placed by the bone-deep ache of manual labor and the constant, nagging realization of how little they actually knew about construction. David and Clara had set up a makeshift living space in what used to be the vestry. Though the air remained damp enough to make their clothes feel heavy against their skin. Every morning began the same way. The sun would peek through the holes in the shingles, casting long, dusty fingers of light across the floorboards. David would wake up first, his back stiff from the thin mattress, and boil water on a small camping stove. They didn't have running water yet. They had to haul blue plastic jugs from a neighbor's well half a mile down the road. That neighbor, a man named Silas, never spoke to them. He would just nod toward the spigot and watch from his porch with a look that suggested he was counting down the days until they gave up. "Today is the floor," David said one Tuesday. Handing a steaming mug to Clara, Clara looked at the main hall. The wood was beautiful heart pine, but it was buried under decades of filth. "We need more than a mop, David. We need a miracle." They started by tearing up the rotted sections near the altar. As David hammered a crowbar into the wood, the sound echoed like a gunshot. Crack, rip, thud. Beneath the boards they didn't find just dirt. They found old newspapers from the 1920s, rusted nails, and thousands of walnut shells left behind by generations of squirrels. By noon, the dust was so thick they had to wear masks. David was sweating through his shirt, his hands blistered despite his gloves. He was working near the heavy stone slab in the corner, the one that had vibrated that first night. He tried not to think about it, but every time his crowbar hit the floor near it, he felt a strange coldness crawl up his arms. "David, come look at this," Clara called out from the far side of the room. He dropped the bar and walked over. Behind the lath, tucked into a small gap in the stone, was a leather-bound book. It was small enough to fit in a palm, and the cover was scarred by fire. David pulled it out carefully. The pages were thin as onion skin. It wasn't a Bible, it was a ledger, record of everyone who had contributed to the building of the church in 1888. John Miller. 4 days of hauling. Stone, Mrs. Gable. 20 loaves of bread for the workers. Thomas Thorne. The iron for the bell. "It wasn't built by a company," Clara whispered, her eyes scanning the names. "It was built by neighbors, people who didn't have much but gave what they had." For the first time in days, the weight on David's chest loosened. They weren't just fixing a building. They were holding on to a story, but the story almost ended that afternoon. David was up on a tall ladder, trying to patch a hole in the ceiling where the rain was coming in. The wood was slick. As he reached out to staple a piece of heavy plastic, the ladder shifted. The feet skidded on the dusty floor. Time seemed to slow down. He felt the sickening tilt of gravity. He grabbed for a rafter, but his fingers slipped. "David," Clara screamed. He fell 10 feet, landing hard on his side. The air left his lungs in a sharp wheeze. For a moment, everything went black. He could hear Clara's frantic footsteps, her voice calling his name as if from a long distance. When he opened his eyes, he wasn't looking at Clara, he was looking at a pair of heavy, mud-caked work boots. An old man was standing over him. He wasn't the man with the lantern from the first night. This man was younger, maybe in his 60s, with skin like wrinkled leather and eyes the color of wood smoke. He didn't say a word. He reached down with a hand that felt like a vice and pulled David to his feet as if he weighed nothing at all. "You're lucky," the man said. His voice was deep and slow. "The floor here is harder than your head." Claire reached them, her face white with terror. "Are you okay? Do we need a hospital?" David shook his head, wincing as he felt his ribs. I'm fine. I think," he turned to the man. "I didn't hear you come in." The man gestured toward the back of the church. "The side door hasn't latched right since the blizzard of '78. You can lock it all you want. But the wind knows the way in." He looked around the ruin, his gaze lingering on the holes in the roof. "You two are the ones who bought this grave?" "It's not a grave," Clara said defensively. "It's a home. Or it will be." The man spat a bit of tobacco juice into a pile of debris. "Folks in town say you're crazy. Say you'll be gone by the first frost. My name is Arthur. I grew up in that third pew." He pointed to an empty space on the floor. "My father helped hang that bell." "We could use some help, Arthur," David said, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. "We have no money to hire anyone, but we have coffee and a lot of work." Arthur didn't answer. He just walked over to the ladder, picked it up, and set it firmly against a different beam. He climbed up with a hammer he pulled from his belt and started working. He didn't ask what they wanted done. He just knew. An hour later, another truck pulled into the gravel drive. Then another. By 4 in the afternoon, there were 6 people in the church. There was a woman named Martha who started sweeping the choir loft without saying hello. There was a young man named Leo who brought a generator and a string of work lights. Nobody talked much. There was no grand speech or celebration. It was just a quiet, steady hum of movement. The sound of saws, the scratching of brooms, and the low murmur of people who had been waiting for a reason to come back inside this building. Clara stood in the center of the hall. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Why are they doing this?" she whispered to David. "I think they missed it," David replied. "I think the building was lonely. And they were too." But as the sun began to set, the atmosphere changed. The townspeople started packing up their tools. As the shadows grew long and purple across the floorboards, Arthur walked over to David. "Listen to me," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "You stay in that front room tonight. Don't go near the cellar. And if you hear the bell, don't go looking for who's ringing it." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows. "The bell is gone, Arthur. It was taken down years ago." Arthur looked up at the empty belfry, his eyes dark. "I know it's gone. That's why it's a problem if you hear it." Without another word, Arthur walked out. The others followed, their taillights disappearing down the long, winding road. David and Clara were alone again. The church felt different now, cleaner, yet heavier. The holes in the roof were patched with plywood, and the floor was swept. But the silence was thick. That night, the rain returned. It started as a soft patter against the stone, then turned into a roar. David lay on the mattress, listening to the water rush through the gutters. He kept thinking about Arthur's warning. He kept thinking about the bell. At midnight, heard it clang. It was a faint sound, muffled by the wind but unmistakable. It was the deep, resonant bronze tone of a massive bell. Clang, clang. David sat up, his heart thumping against his ribs. Beside him, Clara was stirred. Is that the wind?" She mumbled, half asleep. "Stay here," David whispered. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the main hall. The beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the polished sections of the floor. The sound was louder now. It wasn't coming from the tower. It was coming from beneath the floor. He walked toward the corner with the stone slab. The vibration was back, stronger than before. The floor was shaking so hard that a jar of nails on a nearby bench rattled and fell. Spilling across the wood, David reached the slab and shone his light on it. The symbols carved into the edge were glowing not with light, but with a strange, oily shimmer, like moonlight on water. The bell sound was deafening now, a rhythmic pulsing that felt like it was coming from inside his own chest. He reached down, gripped the iron ring, and pulled. This time, Beneath it was a set of narrow stone stairs leading down into a darkness, so deep the flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by it. The smell that drifted up was sweet like lilies and fresh rain. David took the first step down, then the second. "David, don't." Clara's voice came from behind him. She was standing at the edge of the hall, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide with fear. "I have to see," David said. He descended into the cellar. It wasn't a basement. It was a cavern, carved directly into the bedrock. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden crate, rotting and covered in cobwebs. The clanging sound was coming from inside the crate. David approached it, his hands shaking. He pried the lid back. Inside, nestled in a bed of old straw, was the bell. It was beautiful, engraved with images of vines and stars, but the bell wasn't moving. There was no clapper striking the side. Yet the sound was vibrating out of the metal itself, a hum of pure energy that made the air feel electric. Attached to the top of the bell was a tarnished silver key. David reached out to touch the metal. The moment his skin made contact, the sound stopped instantly. The silence was so sudden it felt painful. He looked at the key. He picked it up, and as he did, he noticed something at the bottom of the crate. It was a photograph protected by a piece of cracked glass. He wiped away the dust. The photo showed the church on the day it was dedicated in 1888. A crowd of people stood out front, smiling. In the very front row was a man who looked exactly like David, same jawline, same eyes, same way of standing, and next to him was a woman who looked exactly like Clara. David felt the world tilt. He heard a soft footstep on the stone stairs behind him. He spun around, expecting to see Clara. Instead, he saw Arthur. He wasn't looking at David. He was looking at the bell. "It took you long enough to find it," Arthur said softly. "The town didn't forget this church, son. We were just waiting for the people in the picture to come back and finish what they started." The silver key felt cold in David's hand, a sharp contrast to the strange warmth that had been radiating from the bell only moments before. He stood in the damp, quiet cellar, staring at Arthur. The old man's face was a map of lines and shadows, and in the dim light of the flashlight, he looked less like a neighbor and more like a guardian of a secret that had been buried for a century. "What do you mean, come back?" David asked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I've never been to this state before 3 months ago. My family is from the coast. We don't have any roots here." Arthur stepped off the last stone stair, his boots silent on the earth floor. He pointed a gnarled finger at the old photograph David was holding. "The blood knows things the mind forgets. That man in the photo, that's Thomas. He was a stonecutter. He didn't just help build this place. He carved the very foundation we're standing on. And the woman. She was the one who made sure the fire never went out in the winter." Clara came down the stairs then, her footsteps hesitant. She took the photo from David, her breath catching as she saw the resemblance. It was like looking into a mirror made of sepia and dust. "This is impossible," she whispered. "David, look at the necklace she's wearing." David leaned in. Around the neck of the woman in the 1888 photo was a small, heart-shaped locket with a distinct chip in the enamel. He looked at Clara's neck. She was wearing the exact same Locaton heirloom, passed down from her grandmother that she had worn since their wedding day. The silence that followed was heavy. The air in the cellar seemed to grow thicker, smelling of ancient pine and something metallic. "This town was built on a promise," Arthur said, leaning against the wooden crate that held the silent bell. "A promise that this land would always be a place of refuge. But when the mills closed and the young people left, the promise was broken. The church went dark. And when the church went dark, the town started to wither. You think it's a coincidence that the roof started caving in the same year the last shop on Main Street boarded up?" David shook his head, trying to find a logical explanation. "Buildings fall apart because of physics, Arthur, not because of promises." Arthur gave a small, sad smile. "You'll learn. This isn't just wood and stone. It's the heart of the valley. And right now, the heart is skipping beats. The next morning, the sun rose over the hills, but it didn't bring the usual clarity. A thick, milky fog had rolled in, swallowing the trees and making the church look like it was floating in a cloud. David and Clara didn't talk much about the cellar. They couldn't. It was too big, too strange to put into words. Instead, they threw themselves into the work. The task for the day was the most dangerous one yet, clearing the massive, rotted beams from the choir loft that were threatening to collapse onto the main floor. They didn't have a crane. They didn't have a crew. They only had a system of ropes and pulleys that David had rigged up, and the hope that the old wood wouldn't splinter at the wrong moment. Around 10 a.m., the sound of engines broke the silence. David walked to the front doors and squinted through the fog. One by one, vehicles appeared. Not just the trucks from the day before, but older cars, tractors, and even a school bus. Dozens of people stepped out. There was a woman carrying a crate of sandwiches, a man with a chainsaw over his shoulder, and a group of older men carrying toolboxes that looked like they had seen 40 years of hard use. A man David hadn't met yet, tall, with a shock of white hair and a carpenter's pencil tucked behind his ear, walked up the steps. "I'm Miller," he said, extending a hand that felt like sandpaper. "I heard there was some heavy lifting to be done. My grandfather helped with those beams. I figured I owed it to him to make sure they didn't hit the floor." "We can't pay you," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nobody asked for a paycheck," Miller replied. "We just want to hear that bell ring for real. The wind's been playing it for too long." The work that followed was a symphony of human effort. The townspeople moved with a coordination that was eerie, as if they knew the building's skeleton by heart. They didn't need blueprints. They knew where the weight-bearing walls were, where the hidden rot was, and where the original builders had left breathing room in the masonry. As the hours passed, the tension that had been coiled in David's stomach began to unwind. He watched Clara sitting on the porch with the local women, peeling apples and listening to stories about the town's glory days. They talked about the festivals that used to happen in the meadow, the way the stained glass would throw colors across the snow in December. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the first miracle happened, the one they would talk about for years. They were trying to lift the main support beam, a massive piece of oak that weighed nearly 1,000 pounds. Even with 10 men pulling on the ropes, the beam wouldn't budge. It was wedged tight into the stone, rusted bolts anchoring it to a past it didn't want to leave. "It's no use," Miller shouted over the groaning of the ropes. "The stone has gripped it. We'd need a hydraulic lift to get that out without bringing the whole wall down." The men let go of the ropes, exhausted. The mood shifted instantly. The optimism of the morning vanished, replaced by the cold reality that the building might be too far gone to save. If that beam didn't move, the renovation couldn't continue. The city inspectors would condemn the site by the end of the week. David looked at the beam, then at the silver key still tucked into his pocket. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to go to the bell tower. "Wait," David said. "Just give me a minute." He ran inside, climbed the shaky ladder to the belfry, and stood in the empty space where the bell used to be. He looked out over the fog-covered valley. He didn't pray in the traditional sense. He just put his hand on the cold stone and whispered, "We're trying. We just need a little help." A sudden gust of wind to scold, and smelling of the cellar whirled through the tower. It was so strong it nearly knocked David off his feet. Down below, the people gasped. The bell tower didn't shake, but a sound erupted from the stone itself. It wasn't a metallic ring. It was a deep, low frequency, like the earth itself was humming. At that exact moment, the massive oak beam groaned. Without a single person touching the ropes, the beam slid out of its stone socket, as if the walls had simply opened up to let it go. It hovered for a heart-stopping second, then settled gently into the slings the men had prepared. Silence fell over the property. The men at the ropes looked at their hands. Miller looked up at the tower, his face pale. The stone let go. Someone whispered. David came down from the tower, his legs shaking. When he reached the ground, the townspeople weren't cheering. They were standing in a circle, looking at the ground near the foundation. "David." "Look," Clara said, pointing where the beam had been stuck. A small spring of water had begun to bubble up from the dry, dusty earth. It wasn't muddy or dark. It was crystal clear, cold as ice, and it flowed with a strength that suggested a deep, hidden river had just been uncapped. "That's the old well," Arthur said, appearing from the back of the crowd. "The one they said went dry during the Great Depression. The one they told us was gone forever." The people began to laugh, nervous, joyful sound. They brought over buckets and cups. The water tasted like nothing they had ever had before, sweet, pure, and full of life. It was more than just a plumbing solution. It was a sign. The land was waking up. That night, after the townspeople had gone, David and Clara sat by the new spring. The sound of the running water was the most beautiful thing they had ever heard. "Do you think they're right?" Clara asked, leaning her head on David's shoulder. "About us? About the photo?" David looked at the church, which now had a sturdy new spine thanks to the beam. The building looked different in the moonlight, less like a ruin and more like a sleeping giant. "I don't know if we were chosen," David said, "but I know that for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm wandering. I feel like I'm exactly where I was always supposed to be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the smooth stone with the word "redeem" on it. In the darkness, I could have sworn the letters were glowing just a little bit brighter, but the miracle of the water was only the beginning. As they walked back toward the front doors, they noticed something pinned to the wood. It was an envelope, heavy and thick. David opened it. Inside was no letter. But whose value and weight alone was enough to finish the entire roof, and on the back of the envelope, in the same elegant cursive they had found in the jar, were 4 words: "The foundation is ready." The morning after the discovery of the coins was unlike any other. The air didn't just feel cold. It felt charged, as if the very atoms of the church were vibrating with a new kind of energy. David sat at the small wooden table, the gold coins spread out before him. They caught the morning light, casting small, dancing reflections on the ceiling. Each coin was a heavy physical proof that they weren't just fixing a building, they were part of something that defied the logic of the modern world. But as the old saying goes, where there is light, shadows are sure to follow. The sound of a car engine, not the rattling truck of a neighbor, but the smooth, expensive purr of a high-end black sedan, pulled David's attention to the window. 2 men in sharp charcoal suits stepped out. They looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the muddy field and the peeling stone of the church. They didn't look like they had ever held a hammer in their lives. David met them on the porch. The lead man, who introduced himself as Mr. Thorne, had a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He held a leather briefcase like a shield. "It's a remarkable effort you're making here," Thorne said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Truly, the town is talking about nothing else. But we represent a development group that sees a different future for this ridge. A resort, perhaps? Or a luxury retreat? The church, unfortunately, doesn't fit the blueprint." He opened the briefcase and slid a single sheet of paper toward David. The number written at the bottom was more money than David had ever seen in his life. It was enough to buy a mansion in the city, to retire, to never worry about a leaking roof or a cold winter again. "We know about the structural issues," Thorne continued, his eyes scanning the building with a look of hidden contempt. "The city is going to find more problems soon. The permits will get harder to get. The costs will rise. This offer is only on the table for 48 hours. David didn't look at the paper for more than a second. "The church isn't for sale. It's not just a piece of land." Thorne's smile flickered. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Sterling. It's just a matter of when the reality hits you. We'll be back on Friday for your signature. I'd suggest you use this time to think about your future, rather than a past that's already dead." As the sedan sped away, kicking up dust, David felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He knew Thorne wasn't just making a threat. Men like that had ways of making life very difficult. That afternoon, the pressure began. A city inspector arrived, someone they hadn't seen before, and began citing them for violations that seemed impossible. The new spring of water? He claimed it was a drainage hazard. The reinforced beams? He said the wood wasn't up to modern code. It was clear that Thorn had friends in high places. By Wednesday, the mood in the town had shifted. People were still coming to help, but they looked over their shoulders. Rumors were spreading that the town's taxes would rise if the church wasn't sold to the developers. "David, what if we're being stubborn?" she asked as they sat by a single candle that night. "Look at the violations. Look at the money they're offering. We could build something new. Somewhere where we don't have to fight every single day." David looked at her, then at the wall where the old photograph hung. The woman in that picture? She didn't leave when the mills closed. "If we give up now, we're not just losing a building. We're losing the heart of this place." The turning point came on Thursday night. A storm was rolling in, the kind that makes the windows rattle in their frames. David was in the cellar, sitting near the massive bell in the crate. He felt a strange pull toward it. He remembered the silver key. He took the key from his pocket and looked at the bell. There was a small keyhole hidden behind one of the engraved vines. He inserted the key and turned it. There was no sound of a lock clicking. Instead, the bell began to glow a soft, golden light that pushed back the shadows of the cellar. And then, the beyond belief moment happened. The bell began to rise. It didn't move fast. It drifted upward, as light as a feather, passing through the open stone slab and into the main hall. David followed it, his heart racing. Clara stood in the middle of the church, her mouth open in shock as the massive bronze instrument floated past her, defying every law of gravity. It didn't stop in the hall. It continued upward, through the rafters, straight into the belfry. And the bell locked itself into the original iron hooks, the ones Arthur had said were too rusted to hold a bird, let alone a bell. The moment it touched the hooks, a pulse of light exploded from the tower. It wasn't a flash that hurt the eyes. It was a wave of warmth that rolled out across the entire valley. In that instant, every person in the town, those who were sleeping, those who were worried, those who were skeptical, all felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. The fear that Thorn had planted simply evaporated. On Friday morning, Thorn returned. He walked up the steps with a pen in his hand, looking triumphant. "Ready to sign?" he asked. David didn't say a word. He looked up at the tower. Suddenly, the bell began to ring. It wasn't David pulling a rope. The bell was ringing itself, a deep, majestic sound that could be heard for 20 miles. It was the sound of a heartbeat returning to a body. With every strike of the bell, the ground beneath Thorn's feet seemed to reject him. He stumbled back, his expensive suit getting covered in the very mud he had looked down upon. The briefcase fell open, and his papers were caught by a sudden wind, swirling away into the trees. "What is that?" Thorn shouted, covering his ears. "Stop that noise." But the townspeople were already arriving. They weren't coming to watch a sale. They were coming because the bell had called them home. They formed a silent wall between Thorn and the church. Arthur stood at the front, his arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "The church has made its choice," Arthur said, "and so have we." "You're on the wrong side of the fence, Mr. Thorn." Thorn looked at the crowd, then at the glowing bell tower, and finally at David. For the first time, he looked afraid. He scrambled back into his car and sped away, never to return to that valley again. As the echoes of the bell finally faded, the sun broke through the clouds, hitting the stained glass that Clara had spent weeks cleaning. The colors, deep reds, brilliant blues, and vibrant golds, spilled across the floor. Painting the dust in the air like a rainbow, they had survived the test. The leap of faith had led them through the fire, and they had come out stronger on the other side. The church was standing, but its purpose was only just beginning to be revealed. David looked at Clara and took her hand. "We did it," he whispered. "No," Clara said, looking at the townspeople who were now laughing and hugging each other on the lawn. "We didn't do it. We just opened the door so it could happen." The days leading up to the grand opening felt like the final moments of a long, exhausting dream. The air in the valley had changed. It no longer felt heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. Instead, it felt light, carrying the scent of fresh pine shavings and the sweet water from the new spring. David and Clara hadn't slept more than a few hours a night, but they didn't feel tired. It was as if the building itself was feeding them energy. What started as a few neighbors helping out had turned into a full-scale restoration of the town's spirit. People who hadn't spoken to each other in 20 years were now standing side by side, painting window frames and polishing the old brass fixtures. Martha, the woman who had first come to sweep the floors, was now in charge of the kitchen area, which was stocked with food donated by every family in the county. "It's tomorrow," Clara said on a Friday evening, standing in the center of the hall. The space looked unrecognizable. The floorboards were sanded and sealed, glowing a deep honey color under the new lights. The walls were a soft, warm white, and the altar, the place where the old oak beam had once been stuck, was now a beautiful stage of stone and wood. "No," David said, wiping a smudge of grease from his forehead. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong. For Thorne to come back with a bulldozer, or for the roof to start leaking again." "Look around, David," she replied, gesturing to the windows. "The building isn't fighting us anymore. It's breathing." That night, a calm settled over the property. There were no strange hums, no vibrating stones, and no mysterious shadows. It was just a quiet, solid peace. David took one last walk around the perimeter with his flashlight. He stopped at the spring, which was now a stone-lined pool where the water flowed clear and constant. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small stone with the word "redeem" on it. He realized he didn't need to carry it anymore. He knelt and placed the stone at the bottom of the pool, watching it settle among the pebbles. Saturday morning arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted. Long before the official opening time, cars began to line the winding road. Some had heard the story of the magic bell, while others were former residents who had moved to the city decades ago but felt an irresistible pull to come back one more time. Arthur was the first to arrive, wearing a suit that was clearly 30 years old but perfectly pressed. He didn't say much. He just walked up to David and handed him a heavy iron key. The original key to the bell tower that had been missing since the 1950s. "You won't need the silver one today," Arthur said with a wink. "The bell knows its own voice now." At exactly noon, the doors were thrown wide. The crowd poured in, but they didn't rush. They entered in a hush, their eyes tracing the soaring arches and the way the light danced through the stained glass. There were no assigned seats. People sat where they felt comfortable in the pews, on the floor, or standing along the back walls. David stood at the front. He hadn't prepared a speech. He looked out at the faces: Miller, the carpenter, Martha, Silas, the neighbor who had finally brought over a basket of bread, and hundreds of strangers. "We didn't come here to build a museum," David started, his voice steady. "And we didn't come here to be heroes. We came here because we were looking for something that felt real. We thought we were saving this church, but the truth is, the church saved us. It reminded us that nothing is ever truly abandoned if one person still believes in it." As he spoke, a movement in the back of the room caught his eye. A woman was standing near the entrance, wearing a long coat. She looked exactly like the woman in the 1888 photograph. For a second, David's heart stopped. But then she smiled and adjusted a scarf, and he realized she was just a local girl who shared those same old valley features. It was a reminder that the past wasn't gone. It was just living in new skin. Then, the final miracle, the one they call the beyond belief moment, began. It started as a soft sound, like 1,000 glass harps being played at once. It wasn't coming from the bell tower yet. It was coming from the stained glass windows. As the sun hit a specific angle, the vibrations of the light against the glass created a hum that filled the room with music. It was a melody no one had ever heard, yet everyone seemed to know. Then the bell in the tower began to ring. But it didn't just clang. It joined the melody of the windows. The sound was so pure and so powerful that people in the crowd began to weep, not out of sadness, but out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of being home. In that moment, the physical boundaries of the building seemed to fade. The church wasn't just a structure of stone and wood. It became a vessel of light. People who had arrived with old grudges found themselves shaking hands. Those who had been sick or tired felt a sudden surge of strength. It wasn't magic in the way of a fairy tale. It was the miracle of shared faith and hard work finally blooming into something divine. After the ceremony, the celebration spilled out onto the lawn. There was music and dancing and more food than the town had seen in a generation. The church had officially become what David and Clara had dreamed, a sanctuary for everyone. It wasn't a place for just one type of person. It was a community hub where the doors stayed unlocked 24 hours a day. As the sun began to set, casting a deep purple glow over the mountains, David and Clara walked away from the noise of the party toward the edge of the woods. They looked back at the church. With the lights glowing from inside, the building looked like a giant lantern sitting on the hill, a beacon for anyone lost in the dark. "What happens now?" Clara asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Now we live," David said. "We keep the roof patched, we keep the water running, and we make sure the light never goes out again." They saw Arthur standing by the cemetery gate, looking at a headstone that had been cleaned of all its moss. He looked at peace. He gave them a slow nod and then faded into the shadows of the trees. They realized then that the miracle wasn't the floating bell or the glowing stones. The real miracle was that a broken-down couple in a broken-down town had looked at a pile of ruins and seen a palace. They had taken a leap into the void, and instead of falling, they had learned how to fly. The Church of St. Jude was no longer an abandoned relic. It was a living, breathing testament to the idea that nothing is ever truly lost. As the moon rose, the bell gave one final, soft chime, quiet thank you to the two strangers who had dared to believe in a pile of old stone.